I think this idea that sort of the COVID pandemic and our response revealed the interconnectedness of supply chains in some positive ways, right? Like the medical supply and clean room example. I think thinking through resilience not as just a space supply chain issue, but across those sectors is going to be so important because there is so much interconnectedness, and it's very easy to make decisions in a vacuum and not think about those broader effects.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. Today's episode is part of our Deep Dive series that includes discussions on U.S. national strategy for space, as well as U.S. leadership in commercial space and science and exploration, as well as some other topics. In this episode, guests talk about securing the space supply chain in terms of both stabilizing it and making it more resilient, especially in a time of smaller, more proliferated satellites. How has PLEO architecture changed the vulnerability of supply chains? What ways do companies work vertical integration and supply chain shocks into their business models? What other sectors compete with space for things like materials, vendors, and talent? Lori Gordon, Systems Director at the Aerospace Corporation and partner here at the Center, leads the discussion with our Senior Policy Analyst, Andrew Berglund, using his recent research found in the Space Agenda 2025 Compendium. If you enjoyed today's show and you want to learn more, you can go to csps.aerospace.org/SA2025, where you'll find his paper, as well as others, aimed to inform the future of U.S. leadership in the space sector. Over to Lori and Andrew now.
Thanks, Colleen. It's my pleasure to be here with Lori. Lori, how are you doing today?
Well, how are you, Andrew?
I'm excellent. I'm excited to get this conversation started and talk about supply chain with you.
Excellent. Can't wait. All right. So, you're in Colorado Springs, I'm in DC. We're kind of connecting across, the continental United States. It's interesting to think about how many supply chain companies across the tiers are located between you and I, but then also, between El Segundo, Aerospace's, one of many sites that we have. And we'll figure out, what that statistic looks like. But just into the first question. So, your Space Agenda supply chain article discusses several trends that we all need to be cognizant of, from acceleration to commercialization and miniaturization. So what drove these trends in the first place? Sort of go back to the origin story and talk about were we always having some of the challenges that we are seeing now? How do you characterize sort of the past to the present? And then we'll talk about the future in a second.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think we have to talk about supply chain in this broader narrative, and there's really two underlying trends that I think are important in this discussion. The first is the move towards smaller satellites, so across commercial space constellations and increasingly across government and defense constellations. We're seeing satellites in the several 100-kilogram range performing missions that we used to use several ton satellites to do. So that's kind of the first key underlying trend. The second one is this move toward proliferation, which is a hard word to say and a hard word to describe. But at its core, it's using many satellites networked together to perform missions that we used to do with a couple of satellites or even a single satellite. So it's more at the network level rather than sort of the individual hardware of the satellite level. So those are the two kind of underlying trends that are really important: smaller satellites and proliferation of those smaller satellites. I think the next connection for that is the enablers that are allowing those trends to really take hold right now. And really the trends are both sort of products of commercial innovation. The first is we have, as you kind of pointed out, miniaturization, right? So packing more capability into a smaller form factor allows us to have those smaller satellites. Some of that's tied to kind of advancements in microelectronics, advancements in integrated circuits, right? So these broader sort of trends that are kind of feeding into the space sector. And then the second commercial innovation that gets a lot of attention is the decrease in launch costs and really opening access to space because it costs less to get each kilogram on orbit. So we're seeing, over the past 2 decades, a dramatic drop in the cost to get a satellite on orbit. So you have sort of the trends and the enablers. And then I think it's important to think about the threat environment as an accelerant. So over the last 15 years, we've really seen a shift in our understanding of how our high value space assets can be threatened by a range of potential adversary capabilities. And that's really driving us to think and driving the Department of Defense, I think in particular, to think about the ways it needs to adjust its assumptions and its planning and its systems to account for that. So kind of how does that connect to supply chains is the next piece. So following those trends, right, more satellites, proliferated constellations is significant for supply chains. So the first thing it means is an increased quantity of things. So even if they're smaller satellites, maybe the components or subassemblies are smaller, we need more of them just to field out these constellations, in the hundreds over the near term, and that could grow into the thousands in the future. And then there's shorter timelines. So we're operating under more schedule pressure to get these satellites built and launched. So rather than sort of the decade-long development of space systems, we're working towards something more on the order of a couple of years, getting from contract award to launch for these defense systems. And then I think the last piece that's really important is sort of new and different technologies. So that networking piece between small satellites in a proliferated constellation is really important. One of the key technologies we're seeing kind of take place is optical communications. We need sort of more robust connections between each satellite and then faster data transmission between all those. So I kind of a long answer to your question, but I think it's all of those pieces: the trends, enabling technologies, and then the sort of impact to the supply chain that we're really here to talk about.
Right, absolutely. Kind of tracking back to the concept of miniaturization, you can kind of think about that in some broader sort of backstory, other, IT trends we've seen, Moore's Law. That's essentially what, Moore's Law we've seen in all these other, when you think about the Gartner hype cycle, and sort of, when is the maturation of these technologies, and they all become, many more in a smaller space, and sort of, what does that trend look like? And then, relative to, the systemic nature of this, the proliferation of this, what's happening and has been happening over the last several decades is the digitization of, these physical parts that are coming together and sort of creating that network. And as you also mentioned, when you create that connected network, it becomes sort of a platform for targets, for adversarial threats. And it creates more of a risk platform, essentially, as well. And so kind of want to park that conversation for a little bit later on in the conversation, but also want to kind of dig into, when we're thinking about, who is driving this. So we've talked about what are the drivers and how has this been realized? But when you look at DoD, who are the organizations that are thinking through this? We know Space Development Agency, SDA, DIU, but sort of who are the key players that are pushing this? And the other question, we can get into is, when you think about the systems of systems pyramid, so you're thinking about, the pyramid where there's technology development at the bottom, very independent technologies, which is sort of the classic, space development approach. And then you're moving up to systems, and then systems of systems. And eventually you're getting to the top, which is, the penultimate, or the ultimate goal is, you're developing evolvable ecosystems. And that's really what we're seeing in PLEO. And so when you're developing at such a high level with so many interconnected systems, it becomes really intricate, and so many supply chains are involved in this. And so that becomes a much more complex issue when we're developing those systems. So, you covered all this, but that just kind of orienting. Now we're looking at the top of the pyramid, where we used to look at the bottom of the pyramid and developing these independent technologies like a ComSat. It's sitting up there by itself, big juicy target, but really not connected to anything. And now we're looking at these evolvable ecosystems, and so that becomes a whole different story.
Yeah. And I think there's a good way to connect those two threads is through the story of the Space Development Agency. And they were really created to sort of shake up the approach, right? I think there was a strong recognition among Department of Defense leadership that new approaches to space capabilities was needed. And they decided a new organization was needed to pursue those capabilities. So there's a linkage between that understanding that, hey, something new is happening in the space domain, and we are going to charter a new organization to take advantage of that. So Space Development Agency, I think, was really created with this mindset of pursuing sort of an architecture or a system of systems approach, and then working backwards to some degree to figure out what missions best fit under that approach and how we would kind of prioritize those different missions. So there's been a lot of growth kind of over the 5 years that Space Development Agency has been around. And obviously there are other important players. So Space Systems Command is doing proliferation in medium Earth orbit. DIU is doing a lot. Space Rapid Capabilities Office is also heavily involved. So it's a broad shift among those kind of Space Force acquisition organizations. But I think Space Development Agency is really at the forefront of kind of proving this out. And I think, exactly as you said, right? It's about developing these sort of end-to-end capabilities, looking less at individual satellites and thinking how they all fit together. And that brings you right back to supply chain and the importance of getting supply chain across like many different levels, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on that point, so when you think about the maturation of organizations within DoD, and when sort of they came about, you mentioned SDA is a relatively young organization. They are acutely aware of supply chain shocks that they've seen, whereas some of the more legacy organizations may not have come in having seen the shocks or been ready. But, for example, like SolarWinds, that was a cyber supply chain shock that hit, I mean, not just space organizations or space, the space enterprise, but it was a global phenomenon and a more recent event. And so I think that, SDA coming, together relatively recently had this as part of its DNA and thinking through these challenges. Also COVID, when we were, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of sort of geopolitical as well as natural impacts to supply chain. But there's also sort of that near-term shock that these organizations are having to deal with. Supply chain has been impacting their acquisition, their delivery, their deployment to space. Things were delayed. So, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
I think that I just think to pick up on that idea of shock, right? That suggests this sort of bolt out of the blue kind of idea of things that are so unexpected or unanticipated. And I think it's becoming more normalized for organizations to not think of those as shocks so much, but part of the course of doing business. And maybe some of that's recency of the last couple years since the COVID pandemic, but SolarWinds and other disruptions from software updates. You think about the extreme weather events are a big part of this. I think you're exactly right that it's more normalized to think of these things less as shocks, but something we have to be actively planning for and building in so we're resilient.
Right. You're building it into your business model.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it is an inherent risk that, organizations think of, designing in risk or, designing in security as an added cost. But when you're designing it inherently in the front end, like looking at your supply chain, understanding, what are the logistics risk, what are the potential malicious actor risk, intrusion, looking at your supplier viability, who's in your supply chain, who are the different tiers, who's on their boards, having that information up front and building in whether you're buying insurance around that. What is your risk tolerance related to that supply chain, building that into your business model. Also, having a dashboard about what that looks like is important, and being able to communicate that to your C-suite.
Yeah.
Whether it's your CISO, that will be cyber supply chain, your chief financial officer, whoever that is. So.
Yeah, and I think, again, I know you told me to park the threats conversation, but I live for
Carry
threats.
on.
One of the things I really like, my colleague Brian Whedon at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy talks about this idea that proliferation and small satellites don't sort of solve your threat problem. What they do is funnel the adversary threats. So it moves you from this space where you're really concerned about sort of one-for-one destructive attacks, like a missile launch that destroys your satellite, and you start to move toward thinking about these broader sort of networked effects. It funnels the adversary's attention to things like cybersecurity and supply chain. So that's another way that I think it reinforces sort of new thinking. And I'm just wanted to be upfront that I've stolen that idea. I think it's a really helpful way to think about where we are now and how the change in these new architectures really shifts how we need to be thinking about the threats and what we need to pay attention to.
I would push back a little bit on that because when you think about, the network that is created by proliferated LEO or any system of systems, it is creating a fabric of opportunity. That entire fabric has holes in it, and so they have a broader spectrum, a broader platform to impose some sort of adversarial attack. So that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Sometimes that comes from a cyber supply chain perspective, so that's kind of where I'm coming from. But there's that perspective. It's more holy, meaning HOL.
Mm-hmm.
EY or HOLY, like, there's more holes in it. It's more porous. It's a more porous system. So that's a challenge too.
Yeah, absolutely. And more things to be paying attention to, more things to be worried about. But that shift, it's a real shift in thinking, and I think it reinforces these new ways of thinking about supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So maybe we switch over to talking about vertical integration and supply chain. And, one thing we're thinking about is trust, and, an organization's trust in their prime, their tier 2, all the way down to the end tier. And how do organizations, what criteria do they use to determine, we're going to be a vertically integrated organization, or we're just going to go, more horizontally, and outsource our supply chain. So sort of what are those key factors that a company, let's just talk about, maybe, an emerging company that's looking to get a contract with DoD, and how do they decide, how they organize their supply base?
Yeah, so vertical integration, I think, is one of these concepts that kind of goes in and out of vogue. But we're really seeing a trend in sort of the commercial space sector carry over into sort of newer or non-traditional defense contractors that are competing for these sort of proliferated small satellite contracts for the Department of Defense. So, I think you're absolutely right. It's partly a question of risk tolerance and sort of trust across your supply chain. And those things are not static, right? Like, many of us went through the experience of hoarding toilet paper. That was a change in our risk tolerance over the past few years. So there's an experience of the supply chain that's going to affect like how you think through those decisions. But it's also not just about these shock events either. Steve Jobs from Apple was sort of famous for talking about controlling the stack, the sort of the key technologies that you need to build your systems, having sort of vertical integration within that stack to allow you to kind of control the process. So there are a number of ways, I think, to think about this, right? It's partly about timing. You want to ensure that you can meet your deliverables. And the more control you have over that stack of key technologies, the better you're able to manage getting those things completed and delivered on time, not disrupting your production process. It's partly about funding. So the Department of Defense is utilizing fixed price contracts for some of these acquisitions more. So those delays are really costly, right? You're only going to get paid a fixed amount for delivering X number of satellites. You don't want to waste time waiting for a lower tier supplier to deliver something that you need to finish that satellite. It's partly about quality control. It's partly about commoditization, right? So how much of your supply chain is kind of available on the market? How replaceable are those components on the market? You have to, kind of go through that risk analysis to understand if I'm not able to get this part or component on time, what is that going to mean to my supply chain? If I don't trust that supplier, how easy are they to replace? And then I think one of the things I've thought through in a few of my papers is what's the alignment to my core business model? So pursuing vertical integration through mergers and acquisitions, essentially buying those capabilities and bringing them in-house is a lot more expensive than building it up organically. You're making a trade-off, right? Like I'm going to buy this company, bring them into my supply chain internally rather than develop it organically, which might take me several years, but you have to pay a premium to do that. So because it's expensive, if you have a lot of different business models, if you have a lot of different product lines, it's going to cost a lot to do that across all those product lines. Whereas if you're kind of very focused, and what we're seeing on some of these newer space companies is a real focus on small sats and proliferation, it's a little easier to make that investment decision and to say, let's bring that production capability in-house.
The challenge there you have is that you need to bring it's not just the technology to build, it's the workforce, the knowledgeable workforce to build it. Yeah. So you need to find, those resources, be able to locate them where you are geographically located, where your production facility is located. And we're seeing challenges like this, in some spaceports, around the country, even internationally, where, they're kind of running into some challenges where they don't have the right expertise. They anticipated having that expertise, but it is just not there. And so you can't build without people and the knowledge and the skills. So that's a challenge too.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's been really interesting to see the Taiwan Semiconductor Company try to build some production capability in Arizona and training the workforce and bringing over folks from Taiwan to help upskill the sort of local labor there. It's extremely challenging and I think the sort of vertical integration story can sound very easy and sort of seductive in that sense of like, oh, we'll just buy that and bring it in-house and that'll solve our supply chain problems. But yeah, I think it definitely does create these other challenges that you have to be really aware of.
Yeah, when you look at some of, thinking about NASA, 60-year agency doing fantastic, leading national, international work. Sometimes there is a piece part that is produced by a mom and pop shop in their garage and, something breaks and they are trying to find, this small company and it might not exist anymore. So there's those types of challenges. Things come at you from, all sorts of directions that you need to anticipate. I guess it's doing that scenario modeling also, kind of thinking through, what are all the possibilities where we may not have a supplier in place and how do we, mitigate that risk. One of the other things I was thinking about, another driver is, security. And some companies would like to control their own security, like in-house. They may not trust. So there's a lot of government regulations that they're requiring companies to ensure their compliance with. And so when you are a prime, you have to have a lot of trust in your tier 1 all the way down to tier N, that they are complying with those security requirements. And so in some cases, it might just be better that you in-house it, because you're in control of your security. Although security obviously is an added cost. But anyway, that's just another consideration.
Yeah.
To think about in that calculus.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, I don't want to sort of lead people or give people the wrong impression that the sort of vertical integration approach is sort of the approach. I don't think we know kind of how this plays out within sort of the space sector. And I think, like everything else, it's going to be a mix of really effective, non-traditional, newer companies that are able to vertically integrate, maybe some more horizontally integrated. It's going to be a mix of traditional defense contractors. So I think very much the jury is still out on kind of what the approach is or approaches are. But I think it's important that this is a trend that's happening, and to think through the implications of the trend and kind of what it means for the Department of Defense. And, ideally, we have a very robust, diverse defense industrial base that's able to meet the department's needs in a variety of ways. But I think it's just a very interesting time to kind of see how these trends are playing out.
Yes, and on that point, right, exactly. It's, it will trend up and down. We can just expect that, because we've seen that with so many other components of space enterprise, whether it's, investment in space insurance, it's always going to be like cyclical, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, we were talking a lot about, Department of Defense, but also there is that commercial sector that's independently building things and has their own risk tolerance and thinking through these same questions as DoD. So, it's fascinating to watch that sector kind of grow in parallel, and we're seeing more of that integration and what that looks like.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I don't think we know really clearly what the demand is for the Department of Defense, and I think that will be a really important piece. So, we can talk about sort of the Space Development Agency having several hundred, a constellation of several hundred satellites that they're trying to maintain. But if that mission set grows and that demand grows, like, we could see a real increase in those numbers. We're likely not going to get to the many thousands of satellites in commercial constellations for the Department of Defense, but we're going to get up there somewhere. And I think that number is kind of unknown, and I think that creates some uncertainty in sort of how big the demand is and how many suppliers will be needed to meet the department's needs.
Yeah, and on that point, and thinking about other players and partners, like, geopolitically. So, the United States, we are engaged in various partnerships. For example, one of the most recent is AUKUS. So we're working with, the UK and Australia to better understand their capabilities, what they are looking to us to help them with, and vice versa. Also, in terms of workforce, skill set, supply chain, they're building up a lot of capabilities that, the United States could benefit from, national security, civilian side as well. So we're always thinking about, like, this, more of a global approach and, partnership related to identifying additional suppliers as part of our partner network, and who those may be, and how we can more easily access them, how we can also support and enable them. So that's another consideration that I think some of these global partnerships are thinking through as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I knew I could rely on you to bring up international partners in this conversation. And I think we could do a whole nother show on that. Maybe we will. One thing I will say about that is this concept of proliferation really opens the door for some of those partnerships more widely, right? So it's the sort of shift to more networking and interoperability between diverse satellites. That perfectly fits with a construct of bringing in more international partners and having these more mixed, commercial, defense, international constellations of satellites that are providing capabilities as a network. So I think that's one of the really exciting future developments that we'll watch. And I think, again, having those international supply chains with close allies and partners is an important part of the resilience story as well.
Yes, and also with these partnerships come reduced trade barriers. So we're able to be open to an increased diversity of suppliers with our partners. So that is an interesting development. We're seeing, AUKUS moving that way. And so to be determined, maybe we'll have another show once some of those regulatory irons are worked out. But we can definitely look forward to some future opportunities related to increased partnerships related to a diversity of suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will refocus us a little bit. We got into this discussion already, but I guess I'll return us to this idea of supply chain shocks, right? And we've experienced a few different types of them. We've already talked about a few different types of them, but how do you think the different supply chains or the companies that are reliant on supply chains respond differently depending on the type of shock? So whether that's again, like natural disasters, something like the COVID pandemic, other and unanticipated sort of challenges that might affect international suppliers. How do you think that companies and the US government has to think through how the different type of supply chain shock sort of affects their response and how they think through their options?
Absolutely. So I think it's now part of our business DNA. We are increasingly experiencing a number of diverse shocks that we are building these into our daily operations and also our emergency operations. So for example, we went through a COVID shock, and it was interesting when you see how the space supply chain had to switch to support the medical supply chain. When you think about clean rooms, aerospace ourselves, we provided a lot of our clean room equipment to the American Medical Association at the start of COVID, because we knew that was the priority. So that is something that the space sector also needs to consider when there are shocks that impact all sectors. And you think about, well, okay, what's the priority sector here? Healthcare is going to be the priority. So space is probably going to need to accommodate that. So, how do we build that into our business model? So, another thing, so it's not just space. We have to think about, the global impact here to all sectors of transportation, critical manufacturing, water, energy, healthcare. So I think that is one thing that I've been trying to push the needle on within the space sector. In some ways, I feel that we kind of are, thinking singularly a bit too much, and kind of thinking about how, upstream and downstream, even in terms of the supply chain, space is contributing to many supply chains, transportation, critical manufacturing, but also who's supplying space. And I think it's who's supplying space is what we focus on a little bit more than, who are we supplying as well. Yeah. So I think there's two key considerations when you're thinking about some of these global shocks. Again, they are more frequent. We are seeing them more often. They're becoming part of our business DNA. But the data is interesting, and we need to think about, when you're anticipating what type of shock to expect. Again, we're kind of normalizing the shocks, but it's really about time. So how do we predict? You can predict a natural disaster ahead of time. For example, with a hurricane, we have satellite data. We can tell when a hurricane might be impacting a particular community where there's a lot of the space industrial base is located, whether that be in Texas, California, Florida. So we can anticipate that. So we have that information through satellite imagery, maybe seismic activity with predicting an earthquake. So time and the data, the availability related to time is a critical piece. But then also, when you think about the geographic impact of a shock, to think about that. Whereas when there's a localized attack, for example, let's just say there's a strike on a defense contractor or something like that. Maybe they shut down operations for a day. That might impact, somewhere along the supply chain for a brief period. But if there is, a broader, like a hurricane, or how many, tiers in the space supply chain might that affect? And having that information is critical, related to not just your local environment, but kind of mapping out who is in your supply chain, where are they located? Are they in Vietnam? So you need to have a geographic map in your head and in your digital ecosystem to be able to track those things. So you're not caught unawares that there's some sort of shutdown, in this part of the world that's impacting your operations. And even your future supply chain, not just development, but deployment as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you've hit on this in a couple of different ways, but having that visibility to understand what's the current state of my supply chain, and then how resilient am I to different time horizons and disruptions, how will I adjust? I think is a really important piece that we're seeing greater emphasis on. And obviously there's a continued need for kind of better tools for looking across the space sector to really understand what are those effects? How is this happening? How am I going to be impacted? And how can I plan for that and anticipate that to some degree?
So that's the natural piece of it, the natural disaster. There's also the human adversary, the malicious actors injecting, Trojan horse into, cyber supply chain and, other areas. And so what does the intelligence look like? So there's imagery looking at sort of the natural disaster piece, but there is the intel around these human actors that are impacting the supply chain across many different levels and layers. And so again, it's all about the data, the imagery, and the intelligence.
You're listening to today's show that is part of our deep dive series into some of the most pressing issues in U.S. space policy today. The deep dive series research topics are part of the Space Agenda 2025 Compendium, an effort by the Center for Space Policy and Strategy to lean into some issues that are already at the forefront or likely to emerge in the next few years. Research on these topics and more can be found at csps.aerospace.org. Now back to our speakers.
All right, so Andrew, as part of your Space Agenda 2025 chapter, published by the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, you mentioned several strategies for securing supply chains. So they can be stockpiling, planning, et cetera. So the former is talking about, the risks of obsolescence of capabilities as they sit waiting to be used. And then that latter, planning, requires significant horizon scanning, road mapping to determine what technology that the demand side plans to buy. So what pieces of information do you need to prepare for both of those potential solutions, those potential strategies?
Yeah. It's really, these are problems that defy easy answers, right? So I think back to sort of our risk tolerance discussion. Companies are going to have to make sort of very individualized choices about kind of what their risk tolerance is and how they approach these things. But sort of the stockpiling and the planning are kind of two things to look at that can happen either on the government side or on the vendor, the defense contractor side in the sense of defense acquisitions. And you're right, like stockpiling is not an efficient way to do business. In some ways, it's sort of a rejection of the kind of just-in-time production processes that are sort of foundational to 1950s, 1960s sort of the way that companies did production, right? So sort of lean manufacturing techniques, having these supply chains that delivered the thing you need right on time, so you didn't have this warehousing effect, kind of keeping a lot of excess material on hand. It is kind of a rejection of some of that because it's a trade-off for resilience. And I think again in the sort of context of proliferation and small sats, stockpiling is going to be one thing I think that government and industry is going to have to look at to meet these really rapid timelines. So if we're moving from contract award to launch in 3 years or less, you may not have time to to get the contract award and then make all your decisions about having your vendors lined up and getting those inputs, you might make some choices to have some of that ready beforehand, and plan for winning that award and meeting those short timelines that the Defense Department is going to be demanding. So I think that's one thing we're going to see, and we're seeing it on the government side a little bit, the stockpiling approach through the Defense Logistics Agency, their support to industry, all the way down to sort of raw materials, kind of the critical minerals level. But that may be another thing that the Department of Defense pursues, to have some materials ready so that the vendors that win those contract awards are sort of provided those inputs and not have to worry about where they're going to source those things. Again, it's really difficult kind of to make those trade-offs.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at, stockpiling in the Defense Production Act, that a lot of that, when you look at other sectors, it's trying to protect sort of the healthcare of humans, the survivability of humans in a hurricane. We've seen this in past where, the White House, engages DPA or deploys DPA to certain states or whatever. And so it's interesting. It's now, space, is national defense. So we see that as part of, characterizing, sustaining human lives and health and things like that, but is it in all cases, or, so stockpiling, it's interesting because it transcends different sectors, and, who's able to, get authorization to stockpile. I guess I'm thinking from more of a government perspective, from a government required, a request to stockpile something. I don't know if we're talking about individual companies just stockpiling their warehouses or whatever for their own use or for future use. So there's kind of a difference there as well.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and for companies, it's expensive to buy things without the guarantee that you're going to be able to sell that product, right? So it is going to create some inequities in that sense too. And for the department, who really wants to encourage non-traditional contractors to participate in a sort of a diversity of vendors, that's going to be one of the things they have to work through too. Sort of either well-funded sort of private space companies that are able to just spend their own money how they want and stockpile things. You want to meet the need and deliver the mission, but you also want to ensure this diversity of vendors that are able to compete. So how we balance, I think, competitiveness with some of these things is going to be really challenging.
Absolutely. When you're thinking about, the commercial side, stockpiling commodities, there's also the risk of predatory pricing when there is an incident, and then all of a sudden there's all this toilet paper that this particular company has been stockpiling. Now they're selling it for extraordinary prices. So there's just all these different economic dimensions of it too. In addition to the logistics pieces, there's also sort of, how does that, impact, the supply chain, up and down the supply chain. And even, when you think about that, how does that impact, the price of, communications you might be, buying from, I don't know, SpaceX or whatever. So, it's sort of that upstream impact as well. So there's all sorts of facets and dimensions to think about in terms of the stockpiling. Yeah.
Yeah, and we want to, as much as possible, have sort of smooth demand, right? Like we want all up and down the supply chain for vendors to have a pretty good sense of when their inputs are going to be due and how many they're going to produce. And one of the other risks of stockpiling is you kind of create these peaks and valleys of a large demand signal early on that's then just warehoused goods. But then for that supplier that produced all those inputs, like their demand drops off because they're waiting for the next sort of stockpiling effort. So yeah, that's another piece of it. And partly why I kind of want to start with focusing on there is no single solution here, but I think it's considering the trade-offs and, back to the supply chain visibility point, kind of having a very good sense of where your risks and weaknesses are in your supply chain so you can plan around those.
Yeah, and also on the planning, when you're thinking about, what is the future demand? So you're kind of watching sort of this global market to see, who are the producers, the consumers, where do you fit in that market, and it's expensive to to play in a market where there's so much uncertainty, and this uncertainty is variable. We see when there's some sort of global impact, it sets off markets in different ways. But trying to anticipate what the future demand might look like requires tools, skill sets, and cost to think through those things and then plan for those. So some people just say, I'm going to buy insurance around the future, right? To cushion any shock.
And I think the planning piece is really interesting. That's one area and I talked about this in the Space Development Agency paper we published in July 2024. That's one area where these proliferated constellations have an advantage, because you're building out this network of satellites. You plan for the number of satellites that are going to be part of that network, and then you're going to replenish them on a predictable timeline into the future. So as long as you're maintaining that capability, you're replenishing those satellites and maintaining the number you want on orbit to maintain the coverage you need. So there's some built-in planning advantages in this shift to proliferated small satellites. But on the other hand, and we talked about this a little bit before, kind of the number of missions that are going to be served is sort of unknown, right? There's been discussion about GPS, about satellite communications, about other types of capabilities that could be moved toward more of a proliferated small sat approach. And so, the department planning piece around that is going to be really interesting, because that doesn't just set a near-term demand signal, but a long-term one as well, because of that replenishment cycle of maintaining those capabilities.
Yeah, it's the uncertainty in looking at opportunity and new technology and innovation, that's going to drive demand. But also when we see some of the challenges with geopolitics and, for example, the Russia-Ukraine challenge, and all of a sudden argon, the noble gases were scarce because of this war where both sides produced argon, neon that the space community needed. But not just space community, the energy and transportation industries also needed it. So you've got multiple whammies. The demand is accelerating, not just with the space community, but you're creating an even greater competitive environment between the sectors. And so who organizes that? I don't think that's a challenge that we have not solved yet, and I don't know who is trying to solve that. What the competition between sectors.
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I think another one of these areas where we can't be sort of narrowly focused. I guess sort of and bringing up the Russian invasion or further invasion into Ukraine, I think is important, in terms of those supply shock kind of events that we talked about before. But sort of where else do you see that understanding of the space enterprise's competition with other markets, and its understanding of itself as not so special in all of its supply chain needs, but really competing across those other sectors? Where do you kind of see that unfolding, and in terms of where the real risks are for the space enterprise?
Absolutely. So just in general, in terms of demand on similar commodities that the space enterprise is using, really looking at the automotive industry. They are producing similar capabilities to what the space enterprise is producing. Therefore, they will need similar inputs. So that's one. Another one, we're looking at a lot of big production, critical manufacturing facilities, but also production facilities like solar energy plants, wind farms, electric vehicles, again, even the broader aerospace market. So, thinking through who does the space community need to be talking to make sure that we are working in complement to these other competing, I don't want to say competing industries, but where we are working in complement, where we need to work in complement to make sure that we are able to source our individual supply chains accordingly, and in a prosperous manner. I already mentioned, during COVID, there was a run on the medical community desperately needed clean room supplies. So the space community, obvious go-to for this. So we're, shuttling over, a lot of our space, assets to, the medical community. Absolutely happy to help in such an important cause. So that's one area. Also, kind of digging into, the supplies that are critically needed. Our colleague Karen Jones in Center for Space Policy and Strategy has written about this, critical minerals, rare earths. And one thing that has come out of that in several other areas is how do we, and kind of dovetailing on my previous statements, is that how do we work with other industries to make sure, U.S. industries, to make sure that we are maximizing the space industry's buying power and market influence related to some of these offshore commodities that we so desperately need that we're not producing in the United States. So how are we working together, not just within the space community, but with the energy, the transportation, who needs similar critical minerals, so that we ensure that we as a nation continue to have these. And that might be extended to our allies as well, right? So, we're engaging with allies to be able to leverage some of the supplies and commodities that they have, but also building sort of that network to be able to create that broader allied buying power and market influence over things like that.
Yeah, I think that's several great points in there. And I think this idea that sort of the COVID pandemic and our response revealed the interconnectedness of supply chains in some positive ways, right? Like the medical supply and clean room example. I think thinking through resilience not as just a space supply chain issue, but across those sectors is going to be so important, because there is so much interconnectedness, and it's very easy to make decisions in a vacuum and not think about those broader effects. And again, priorities change, right? Like healthcare was the fundamental priority, and everything else takes a back seat, and that's the right response. And in different situations, those factors may change, but I think that's just a fascinating, maybe sort of underappreciated or under-discussed lesson from the pandemic experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And then thinking about one other additional element is that, in times of scarcity, we are triggered to look for alternatives. So for example, small sat manufacturers were, because of various, global challenges, they were shifting away from space grade components because they had long lead times, and they were favoring more widely available commercial and automotive grade alternatives. So Aerospace has done a lot of research on this. So, what are those alternatives to, those, what were once steady and, tried and true, easily sourced components may not be so easily sourced anymore. So what are the alternatives that we can use? We've looked at this in fuel, propulsion. That's a big area. The pandemic kind of spurred a lot of this research and work, and reaching to find alternatives. So that's been it's been an interesting few years, related to looking at alternatives. So kind of shifting over. So Andrew, just kind of looking to the future. So what's one trend that you see increasing, or what's a trend you see that's decreasing or declining? COVID's kind of on the, we're past it, right? But then the CHIPS Act, is now increasingly finding, domestic sources of suppliers. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, so on the increasing side, I think one that's going to be really interesting is that small sats are increasing, and I mean that literally. So the Starlink constellation, I think the V2 minis that are planned to go up are going to be 700 to 800 kilograms, which is 2 to 3 times what some of the prior generations of those satellites were. So the implications of that are kind of fascinating. And that's partly because, again, that sort of commercial innovation around launch is getting so cheap that we don't need to drive to 100 or 200 kilogram satellite solution. Maybe we can pack some more capability and give it a larger mass. So how sort of government and defense applications respond to that change, I think, will be really interesting. And then what that means for the supply chain. So I just, I enjoy all these examples of sort of the pendulum swinging back and forth. I think particularly in defense acquisitions, but in industry generally, right? Big juicy target satellites, we move to small satellites, and then maybe we're finding a greater diversity of satellites as we have more options for launch. I think that will be a really important story. And then on the decreasing side, I think there's sort of a less skepticism about sort of a more active political role in markets. So, I'm putting myself on a limb to prognosticate about sort of political trends here, but I think there's a more of a bipartisan sense that great power competition and really keeping pace with technology change and potential adversaries means we can be a little more proactive in the domestic market and ensuring that there's resilient sources of supply for those really important things that we need. So you mentioned the CHIPS Act. I think that's an important part of it, bipartisan support for that. So, in our Space Agenda 2025 chapters are about informing the next presidential administration. And I think there is a willingness to kind of think through what are those strategic investments that we can make as a government to ensure we have really strong domestic capability. And so it's a decrease in that sort of traditional hands off the market approach. There's a little more willingness, I think, to intervene and make sure that those markets are strong and ready when we need them.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing some semblance of this in the recent DoD commercial integration strategy, the Space Force commercial integration strategy, because they're kind of setting the pace, and kind of the demand signal, obviously, for how do we work with, the commercial sector, and then how do we better understand what the supply chains look like, across various mission areas that they've laid out, that they are looking for commercial to, lead, co-lead, or, integrated in some way. So that'll be interesting to see, how the implementation strategies focus on the supply chains of those key commercial companies that are working with DoD.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we probably left a number of questions on the cutting room floor, and I think we teed up probably 3 or 4 additional shows. But we'll wrap here. And Lori, it's such a pleasure to talk to you as always. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely, Andrew. Anytime.
All right, Colleen, back to you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both. I loved that you worked in how workforce challenges and international partnerships play into securing and stabilizing the U.S. supply chain for space. To our audience, remember you can read more about these issues at csps.aerospace.org/SA2025, where you'll find Andrew's paper, Strengthening the Industrial Base to Deliver the Future Defense Space Architecture. His research is part of the compendium called Space Agenda 2025 that provides insights into some of the major challenges facing space policymakers today and over the next several years. All of our shows are available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. Follow us on LinkedIn to get notified and engage with our speakers. And thank you to James Liggins, our technical director. And thank you to our audience for watching or listening today.